Okay, so we're here with Emily Hofstetter, who's a research fellow at Linköping University. Emily, thanks so much for agreeing to take part in this interview series.
You are most welcome. I'm very glad to.
So just to kind of start in your early higher education. So you began your higher education at the University of Toronto, where you had an interest in anthropology. And it was there you studied for a master's degree with Jack Sidnell. So I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about your time studying there.
I went from doing biological anthropology into sociocultural linguistic anthropology, because they don't specify at the master's level, at U of T, because Professor Sidnell got me interested in conversation analysis towards the end of my undergraduate. And so after I took a break for a couple of years, when I went back to school, that's what I wanted to do, and he very kindly took me on, and so I did the thing there. At U of T it's situated in anthropology because it's Jack Sidnell who does it, and he is an anthropologist. We did data sessions. I got to participate in a bunch of seminars where Jack was talking about the materials he was considering that eventually became a 2014 chapter in the Cambridge Handbook of Linguistic Anthropology, which was really cool to watch that developed. So it was really fun. To me, that has always been sort of where it came from, but that's just because of my history with it, I guess.
And so can you tell us about what the subject was of your master's?
In that handbook chapter, Jack was looking at how... gosh, I've lost a complete train of thought now. You're going to have to... He was looking at different cultures and how they were looking at intersubjectivity, and how different fieldwork studies had talked about the issue of intersubjectivity. And there's a big chunk at the end of the chapter that's talking about the opacity of mind doctrine, which is something that was a big topic of research, and it's for some people is still a big topic of research in Pacific anthropology, because there are certain cultures that have been reported to treat other people as having less available thoughts than supposedly Western cultures are. And so his chapter critiques that, and I got really interested in how that would translate into talk. So I tried to take a look at that in English conversations, namely through the talk bank corpus, and how people guessed stuff. So do we actually do guessing? Is it accountable? Yes. And so maybe the idea that Western cultures actually do read minds all the time is a bit of a false idea, and a bit of a more Western ideological take on it, and rather than actually how members orient their own actions to do with opacity of mind. So maybe it isn't quite as different as one might think. So Jack looked at it in terms of repair, and how it basically wouldn't be possible to have a culture that had things like third term repair if you literally couldn't assume something about what other people are thinking. And I was taking a very slightly different angle on how you might look at that as an action, basically. Or at least that was the attempt.
Yeah, and I guess in a very related way, what do you consider the boundaries between anthropology and conversation analysis in terms of examining social interaction?
Anthropology to me is the study of humans, and all humans interact. So to me it just makes perfect sense that it's the same. I've always had a weird relationship with disciplines, though. To me they're just they are a collection of different people's historical, of different people's history in approaching a topic, rather than having anything to do with how the science is organized. So you could put interaction analysis in any field, and I wouldn't really mind. Personally, that would just mean having to relearn the assumptions and the expectations that people have towards your topic, and how interactional research might diverge from those assumptions. I think they diverge less from the typical assumptions in anthropology, because most people do go out and actually watch how people get about their daily business, how they do their regular activities. It's really common in anthropology to go and film people doing normal everyday stuff. And it's also got a history of looking at something which is essentially the equivalent of breaching experiments, where you go and, as a researcher who doesn't know as much about the culture, you're kind of there constantly breaching the cultural expectations, and your job is to learn why, or as much as you can about how and why people do things the way they do in that area, in that setting, or in that group. So that's ethnomethodology, just in a fieldwork way, perhaps, that might be a little bit different. So to me, that has always made the most sense as a disciplinary history, but I get the impression that there aren't that many anthropology-based EMCA researchers as there are in other disciplines.
And just moving on, you moved to the UK to study for a PhD with Liz Stokoe at Loughborough University. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your PhD experience when you were there.
Yeah, so it was Professor Sidnell who put me in contact with Liz, who we had a Skype interview, and then we did the application for doing the PhD. And I joined her, and we talked about what kind of topics I could cover, and she hadn't heard anything hadn't heard of anybody doing something on constituency offices. And after asking a lot of different offices, we did find some that said yes. And so I got to do my research on constituency offices, which is how people call into a local politician. It's a fairly common thing in the UK. It's also done in Canada, and quite a number of other countries with different sort of expectations of what they can achieve when you call them and what you might be calling about. And I just studied how people accomplish that and what their expectations were, what kind of things they wanted to do, what complaints they brought forward, usually complaints, and things like that.
And can you share some of your findings from your PhD?
At the time, there was a lot of work on action design that had just come out or was in the process of coming out, and amidst Loughborough doing a lot of work on different service settings, people would look at how people did things that were related to getting a service, so offers and requests as the sort of prototypical ones, but all the associated things like suggestions and proposals and however else you want to gloss things. So a lot of what I was looking at I was inspired to look at how those designs were accomplished in my setting, which was unique. And so the main things I was looking at was how people managed to come forward with some kind of trouble that eventually received some kind of aid. And the very different paths that people could take towards getting that, depending on different things that happened or different issues that they had. Those were sort of the main things. And then I also looked at how people constituted the office as a political space, which didn't very often happen, which is perhaps why there isn't a ton of literature in political science about the constituency office, except its role in getting someone re-elected. So I looked a little bit at how that was a concern for members or not, and how people could kind of bring it into or out of accountability and relevance.
Fascinating. So can you say a little bit about when and how you got interested in embodied action?
I don't think I've ever excluded it. I just think it's all interesting. So to me, it was always there. I think the very first data sessions that I looked at were children playing with toys at U of T with Jack Sidnell, and so that was video research from the beginning. But then I did have video stuff during my PhD, but people mostly just sit at a table and don't do a lot, and there were already some papers coming out about how documents were passed back and forth or made relevant to come out of bags and whatever. And I didn't feel like just sitting at a table chatting, there was a lot I could add with that data at that time. I didn't feel like there was a ton that I was going to do that was really exciting, so I just kind of put the video aspect of it aside. And then when we were finished with the PhD, then I could look at other data. So I was collecting board game data on the side because I like board games and they are relatively convenient to record. And I have some video data of an experiment I did with the psychology students at Loughborough. So there were lots of different other types of data that at that point that I was starting to collect for the next stuff I could look at, and just their video. And I mean, board games in particular are multimodal in their very nature. That's why they're fun, is because they're not digital, and so you don't displace the embodiment into a screen and interact with it through a mouse and a keyboard, you interact with it in terms of passing pieces to each other and things like that, which I think is why people like them even today when there's a lot of more complex or flashy things that you can do. Not to say that digital things aren't multimodal, but they're multimodal in a different way. Like they involve different contingencies, whereas board games are very based on very analog materials that have a huge contrast to that, which is why I think they're popular. But anyway, so that meant that it was impossible not to include that. And that's fun and interesting. So, yeah.
So as well as your PhD at Loughborough, you're also coordinator for DARG, the Discourse and Rhetoric Group. I wonder if you could maybe say a bit about the value of collaborative analysis in data sessions.
That is what makes us unique as a group. That's what makes us, our methods different and interesting and fun. And probably a huge reason why a lot of us like doing this kind of analysis, because we can bring it to other people and discover things as an ensemble. And that there is a formalized way for many heads to make sense of one thing, as well as to find out whether or not we're kind of barking up the right or wrong tree before going too deep into it and things like that. So that's how I learned. That's how everybody learns, I think. Or no, that's not how everybody learns. That's how a lot of people learn if they are so lucky enough to have enough of those people near them or that they can visit. And it's the best way to pass on the skills, because you learn a lot about what counts as relevance, what counts as a member's orientation, what counts as making something accountable, and the myriad of ways we can accomplish that. Yeah, it's really, it's fun, but it's also so critical and so central.
And would you say, having experience of kind of embodied and data, video data and audio data, would you say there's a difference between looking at audio and video data in these types of sessions? Are there differences for kind of scope of analytic insights? Can you feel as though there's a difference in what outcomes you get from these types of sessions?
I mean, if you like just looking at audio data versus looking at video data, because audio data, I think people spend a little bit more time worrying about the transcript in data sessions.
Okay.
Where I find that in sessions where you're looking at video stuff, you look at less. People focus in on a smaller segment of time, and they very quickly abandon the transcript and throw it over their shoulder, and they busily make their own in a way that they can understand. The only thing people will keep to do with multimodal stuff is if you've pre-timed certain things for them. That tends to be useful, but a lot of the other stuff, I mean, the gloss of what you want to call it or anything like that, just it's kind of irrelevant. And so I kind of like that a lot, because it means you get in. To me, it feels like everybody is focused in on the same data more, and you get even more exciting discussions happening. So I like that about it a lot. But I certainly find that a challenge right now with my current data set on climbing, because it can be, climbing is one of those settings where there is a lot that isn't visually available, at least with I think it's not just because of the angles that I have now, although that's definitely part of it, but there's a lot that requires an understanding of how the activity works and what the members are thinking about, like what kind of things are they managing with their hands, and what kind of things do they have to be projecting. That comes from experience of having done the activity, and that can be really difficult to describe and talk about in the data session. And so I can show that that is a thing in a paper, but it means that in the data session we spend less time looking at that, and that is harder to convey because there's not a lot of point when they have to have done it in order to know what it's like.
And also, whilst you're at Loughborough, obviously being very busy at Loughborough, you created a range of fantastically informative YouTube videos for those interested in CA. Such as understanding Jefferson transcription and repair, and we'll put links to the videos in our YouTube description. So I just wondered how you got inspired to create these resources.
Spending too much time on YouTube does that. So that was sort of what I did, because I I didn't watch TV during the PhD, but when I was just tired and didn't want to work, I would watch YouTube. And at the time there were a number of educational channels, like Idea Channel, I think it was called. Oh my god, I can't believe I'm having trouble remembering because it's not that long ago. Idea Channel, let's say, which was just the most fantastic thing, and it just discussed mostly philosophy, but also philosophy with relation to modern culture and internet culture, and it was brilliant. It was, you know, the same kind of talking head. Like, I have 100% copied the talking head skip, cut to a bit of media, and then back to talking head kind of format that and some other channels were using, and because it worked, and those were just really fantastic videos to watch, and you can use in classrooms and stuff like that. And that was why I just wanted to be that guy, and to be as clever as he was, and be as enthusiastic as he was, because I felt that way, but I didn't know yet how to make that into a piece of media where I could share those ideas. And so that was just an attempt to figure out how to do that.
And do you have any plans to record any more videos?
Yep, I have 4 scripts now that are written, and I just haven't sat down to... I mean, I need a perfect backdrop, and lacking that, I mean, what is the point? With my incredibly fantastic and relevant backdrops that I've had before of the window. No, it's been a mix of just, I've moved too much to have time, yeah, mostly it's just been different life events have kind of taken up the time that I was using for that before. But I would very much like to, and I keep, every time I find a bit of media that I like and think is relevant for it, I want to put that in. Like, I watched The Boy and the Beast, which is an anime film, last year, and it has the most amazing series of non-lexical vocalizations in it, and that has to happen as a means of explaining some stuff to do with non-lexicals. So that will be fun. So
that's a video that's definitely going to come up, I think.
It had better. No, it really should, because that's what the grant is about. And I really want to make that happen. As some explanation of that particular project that I get to work on right now.
Well, moving seamlessly to my next question. So in 2018, you moved to Linköping University in Sweden and took up as a position as a research fellow, working with Lelo Kivelik, Sally Wiggins, and others on the Non-Lexical Vocalisations project. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what non-lexical vocalisations you are working on the project.
Like which sounds, or...
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess you picked up on the data that you're using, or some of the data, but...
The data that I just spontaneously... I mean, that's the trouble, is that being on that project, you feel... I constantly feel like I need a camera over my head for every time I bump into something or drop something, which is all the time, so that I can then record the weird noises that I make. So sorry, what was the question?
So, I mean, it's really...
What ones are we working on? Or
well, I mean, what data are you working with? I mean, you did mention the climbing. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about how that's going, and maybe some of your findings on that.
So, I mean, one of the best... the probably will have come out by the time this video comes out is a special issue in ROLSI that has a ton of amazing people working on it with different settings and different focuses on different sounds that are marginal sounds in terms of both the phonetic inventory of most languages that they are situated in, but also in terms of what we consider to be language and words. So this project looks at what those marginal or liminal, I hope I'm not jumping the gun by letting that new term out of the bag, liminal terms, liminal sounds that are supposedly not words but really just fall on a spectrum of the kinds of practices that we use vocally as well as non-vocally to get things done. So it's sort of shining a light on that subsection of things that never really seem to get any attention, especially in linguistics, and even in interactional linguistics, where a lot of the focus on things like discourse markers and particles has been on, those are still most of the ones that have been focused on are still traditionally conceptualized as words, not all of them. I mean, where does O even fit on that category? And whoops is in the dictionary, and so on and so forth. So how it's very much a spectrum of vocal practices and how they are coordinated with the body. And there's a bunch of different settings that we're working on. So you mentioned Leila, who has different settings, including Pilates and dance classes and even people cleaning streets and things like that. And Sally, who has a collection of infant weaning videos. But then we also have Hannah Pelican, who's working on robots and the different sounds that they make. So different sort of autonomous agents and how people interact with them. She has the Cosmo robot, but I think she's also possibly going to work on an autonomous bus and a couple of other things. And then Agnes Löfgren, who is working on theatrical and opera rehearsals. And then I'm working on rock climbing, plus also the board game stuff. So a wide collection of settings for different purposes and different activities, which gives us a lot of different stuff to compare and think about.
And just related, how would you say that non-lexical vocalisations are relevant for understanding orderliness in social interaction?
They kind of punctuate everything that we do. I mean, those sounds, they're not the only ones that get sort of rhythmically timed to go with words, but they're a great way to add that in when you don't have a specific word that you're going to be doing. And especially in a lot of these very physical activities like teaching, dance, or doing climbing, timing those sounds to go with a physical action helps to draw attention to it and to accomplish different things in terms of joint attention, and to mark them as potentially relevant for doing different actions. So Leila has material in the dance where the instructors use different non-lexical sounds to mark out the time, but also in the shape of those sounds phonetically, to mark out how big the motion should be and how quick it should come into play, and what shape it is, like whether or not it's a really strong kick or whether it's a more gentle, I can't dance. And sort of the ones in the rock climbing that I'm looking at right now tend to preface disaster moments. So how certain like grunt strain sounds project a potential problem that's coming up. So whether or not you're going to have to catch somebody on the gear.
And just another kind of related question, I suppose. Where do you consider, or do you consider, the boundaries of language are?
Anything that allows us to get action done. And so that could be inclusive of any kind of resources that we engage with, including cups and pens and computers, but also different aspects of the body. And I think it's interesting which ones we choose to employ at different times, and what combinations of them. And also weird how we divide up those into categories, because in linguistics it's often the case that anything that is not segmental words is treated as a separate category, as paralinguistic material, so prosody and non-lexical vocalizations and other things like that. But then for some reason the voice isn't considered the same modality as the body. Why? I mean, there's a historical reason for that, but why now that we know better? And so it can be really difficult to overcome those different distinctions. And I think there's some evidence that people orient to them as separate, but whether or not that comes out of the same history could also be the reason why. I might have diverged from the question there, but
No, you didn't. So a kind of a more practical question, thinking about the video data you're working with, the rock climbing. So I imagine it's going to be fairly practically challenging data to successfully collect and work with, due to the nature of the activity under study. So are there any particular techniques you use for this kind of data collection?
I don't have a 360 camera yet, so I mean that would be sort of one of the ways to collect just almost everything possible and then kind of pick the angle afterwards. that I find to be relevant for looking at something, maybe one day. But in the meantime, I'm doing a sort of multi-angle thing, mostly from the ground, and I'm working on, I wish I had it sewn so I could try it on now and show my fancy bionic thing, but I haven't finished sewing it because I haven't finished finding the right shape of backpack. I tried one and it didn't work. So anyway, sorry, what I'm talking about, a backpack that the climbers can put on with a sort of third-person camera that just slightly sticks up and out the back, so that you can see their hands and hopefully a little bit of where their face is pointing. I mean, I tested it and that's what you can see, but I haven't sewn it safely enough so I can test it on the wall, because all the backpacks that I've tried, they move around too much when I do tests at home with like pull-ups and stuff. So you need it to have a good connector here and stuff. So I need to find one that I can sew and rip up and not feel sad about. And most of my backpacks I kind of need to get things done, like going places and traveling. So that kind of thing might allow a bit more access, because these people, the challenge is less, I mean, I've sorted the problem of sound with, I have some lavalier microphones that clip into dictaphones, and those go under the shirt. For most people who wear shirts, that's a thing with climbing. And then hook onto their harness or into a pocket. I've tried putting on the arm as well, but because you can't have all these wires on people while they're doing stuff, and I don't think that people will want to wear the backpack all the time. It just means sometimes. That lets people carry a camera as they go up, because they end up being, up to between 20 and 60 meters away from me that way, which is a bit more of a problem because I can't follow them without taking up space on the climbing wall that other people want to use. And then I'd also have to be as good as whatever the available material to climb with them would be, which I'm not, because some of the climbs next to whatever they happen to be climbing are way harder than what I can actually accomplish. And often it's not possible to kind of go around from the top of the cliff and drop a camera. So there's a lot of logistical concerns that probably are not super interesting to listen to, but it's fun. I'm hopeful that the third person camera will work out well, because that could be a cool thing.
And do you have any advice for people collecting similar types of data, not necessarily climbing, but just data that's hard to necessarily get hold of in that sense?
Find people who are happy for you to be a little bit of a guinea pig, who are patient with you. So some of my amazing climbing friends from Canada have been so good. There's also been some lovely people in Sweden, but I've been saving most of the testing of gear so far on amazing people from Canada who have very kindly given their time and been willing to be wired up in weird ways in public places to see what can happen, and that's been very nice of them. That's probably the hardest thing, is just how are you going to get people to do things. That's the biggest hurdle, finding nice people.
Okay, so an easy question now. What do you see the current state of research in the EMCA community?
What does that mean? I mean, what do you mean by the current state of research? Like, is it good? Like,
are there any particular challenges that are currently being faced by researchers in the community?
I mean, what Lorenzo Mandata has identified, and Kenneth Lieberman and several others, in terms of how we deal with senses that are harder to make, that are not visually available. We still rely on, even if we're not looking at things that are literally about verbal and visual stuff, such as with non-lexical vocalizations that are, in theory, not verbal, although vocal. Even if we're looking at those kind of category of phenomena, we're not necessarily able to capture what it feels like to hold on to a rock face that has really tiny holds, and how much more difficult that is in comparison to something that is something really big that you can grab onto. Or indeed what it feels like to have your body be pushed way off balance. So it's hard to understand sometimes why the motions that they're doing are hard, even if they themselves understand what's happening. I mean, another thing that's interesting with the climbing is climbers who have done that climb before, either they've just done it or they did it 10 years ago, because outdoor climbs don't change that much. Sometimes pieces break off, but they don't change that much. They're going to be there for much of your life to go back and go to, as long as the place isn't closed. And that means that some experienced climbers will have memories of a climb that they can shout up at people without actually having done it that day themselves. And so they'll know what kind of weird things are happening to your body, even though they aren't in your body. They're 30 feet below you. And that's really fascinating, but figuring out how to analyze that can be a challenge, because it's sort of like, where did that piece of advice come from? And I might know ethnographically where that piece of advice came from, but it can be harder to show its relevance on the video, depending on the situation. So I think that's a big section where people want to go, but how we will accomplish that as an analyst will be harder, because it starts to rely on stuff that isn't in the video, and gets into the whole what counts as data question, and what we're going to count as validity might start to get pushed, or we will restrict ourselves to things where the validity is safe with what we are comfortable with.
And just finally, could you share any plans or ideas for future research?
No one is looking, okay, maybe someone is. No one is looking at consent. There are a few really interesting studies on flirting, but when will somebody look at people consenting to intimate touching? I know it's a really difficult thing to get data for, but there are people who are hurting and people who literally need this kind of analysis, and that we can provide it. We can actually show what is happening there and show a very scientific, empirically based understanding of what it means to engage in sexual behavior. And what, I mean, we already know from Kitzinger and Wilkinson and Firth, and probably other people I'm forgetting, that progressivity is an issue for saying no in consent situations. But we haven't taken the next step. Where is the Kinsey study from our field? We need it, and we need it now. So that's not in my immediate future, but it would be amazing to see that happen. Because I think I can't imagine a more needed thing in this day and age from our field. But it's not going to be easy to do.